There is a moment, perhaps in the still hours of the night, when the rest of the world has gone quiet and the ordinary defenses of the mind have finally loosened their grip, when a thought arrives that you did not send for. It does not announce itself. It does not come with argument or evidence. It simply settles, like cold water filling a room, until there is no part of you it has not reached. One day you will cease. Not the people around you, not the civilization outside your window. You, the particular arrangement of memory and sensation and voice that constitutes the self you have inhabited your entire life. That arrangement will, at some point, come apart. The thread will break. The signal will end. And what lies on the other side of that ending, no living person has ever returned to describe with certainty. This is perhaps the oldest thought a human being can have. It predates language, predates agriculture, predates the first city and the first written word. In some form or another, every person who has ever lived has lain awake with this knowledge pressing against their chest. The Sumerian farmer, the Greek philosopher, the Aztec warrior, the Egyptian scribe who spent a lifetime perfecting the hieroglyphs on other people's tombs, and then, one evening, faced the slow realization that someone would someday be perfecting the hieroglyphs on his. And here is the thing that should stop you cold, if you allow it to. Not one of those people simply accepted the thought and moved on. Not one civilization, in all of recorded and archaeologically recoverable history, looked at death and said, nothing. Not one culture left their dead without ceremony, without map, without some figure to show the way forward into whatever came next. They built burial chambers more durable than palaces. They wrote instructions for dying. They painted the walls of tombs with the geography of the afterlife. They placed food and gold and ferrymen's coins in the hands of the dead. Why? The easy answer is fear, and there is truth in that. But fear alone does not produce consistency. Fear alone does not generate the same solution again and again across thousands of years and thousands of miles and cultures that never spoke a single word to one another. Something else is happening in the history of human death. Something that, when you trace it carefully enough, begins to look less like primitive superstition and more like a message encoded in myth, repeated across every tradition waiting to be read. That message begins with a single architectural idea, that death is not a wall, it is a door. And on the other side of the door, whether you call it Elysium or the Duat or Mictlan or simply the underworld, there is territory. Strange territory. Territory that the dead must navigate, often through darkness and obstacle and judgment. Territory that, without the right preparation and without the right guide, a soul might wander forever without reaching its destination. The word for that guide, in the language of scholars who study these figures across cultures, is psychopomp. From the Greek psyche, meaning soul, and pompos, meaning conductor or guide. A soul conductor, the figure at the edge of the known world whose function is to take the dead by the hand, or in some traditions, by the collar, and lead them from the familiar into the irreversible. Every civilization, it turns out, had one, or several. The features vary. The names and faces and animals and instruments change. But the function, the essential role of the figure who stands between the living and the dead, who knows both worlds and belongs fully to neither, that function repeats with a precision that cannot be explained by coincidence alone. This is the story of those figures, but it is also something more than that. Because if you follow the psychopomp far enough through the Greek underworld, through the Egyptian Hall of Judgment, through the 9 levels of Aztec Mictlan, you eventually find yourself not in a dead civilization's myth, but in a living question. What does it tell us about the human mind that it has always needed someone to show the dead the way? That question, once you ask it, does not easily let you go. Long before the first pyramid was raised over the Egyptian desert, before the Parthenon cast its shadow over the Aegean, before a single block of Teotihuacan was fitted into place, human beings were burying their dead with intention. The Neanderthal burials at Shanidar Cave in what is now Iraq, dated to roughly 60,000 years ago, suggest that the body was laid in the earth accompanied by pollen, perhaps flowers, perhaps medicinal plants. The evidence is debated, but the disposition of the body itself, the careful arrangement, the deliberate placement, tells a story that needs no translation. Someone, in a world that had no cities and no writing and no theology as we would recognize it, looked at a dead body and did not simply leave it for the crows. They did something with it. They prepared it for a journey. That is the first great idea in the human history of death, that what lies beyond the grave is not absence, but territory, that the dead do not stop moving. They go somewhere, and the way they are sent off determines, in some crucial sense, whether they will arrive safely. This idea that death is geography is one of the most widely distributed beliefs in human history. The specifics differ enormously. In ancient Greece, the dead descend to a shadowed underworld beneath the earth, a vast realm organized into regions of varying reward and punishment. In ancient Egypt, the afterlife is called the Duat, a complex celestial and subterranean landscape through which the soul must navigate a series of gates, each guarded by a serpentine figure requiring the correct password. In the Aztec cosmology, the dead must traverse 9 levels of Mictlan, the underworld, a journey of 4 years that demands crossing rivers, surviving wind of obsidian knives, and passing through a darkness so total that only a dog, a very specific kind of dog, could see through it. The geography changes. The number of obstacles changes. The landscape changes. Sometimes it is water, sometimes wind, sometimes fire, sometimes a set of scales on which the weight of your life will be measured. But the underlying structure is identical. Death is a place with a beginning, a middle, and something at the end that resembles arrival, and the passage between here and there requires navigation. Here is what no one in the ancient world appears to have asked, because the answer seemed self-evident. If death is a journey through difficult and unfamiliar terrain, and if the dead are, by definition, people who have never made this journey before, then of course they need guidance. The logic is almost mundane. You would not send someone alone into unmapped wilderness without a guide. You would not expect a traveler who speaks no Greek to navigate the streets of ancient Athens without someone who speaks both languages. The dead are strangers in a strange land, and strangers need help. But who could serve as that help? Who could exist in both worlds simultaneously, alive enough to receive the newly dead, dead enough to know the way forward? What kind of figure could cross the threshold between existence and non-existence and return, and cross again, and return again, as though the boundary that terrifies every living soul were simply a daily commute? The answer that different civilizations arrived at is, when you look at it carefully, one of the most fascinating and haunting convergences in the history of human thought. In ancient Greece, the figure who occupied this in-between space was not primarily a god of death. He was, in fact, something stranger and more interesting, the god of transitions, of crossings, of every moment when something passes from one state to another. His name was Hermes, and he was perhaps the most paradoxical figure in the entire Greek pantheon. Hermes carried a staff called the caduceus, two serpents wound around a central rod, sometimes depicted with wings at the top. This symbol, which modern culture has largely repurposed as a medical emblem, was originally something more philosophically precise. It was the image of opposing forces held in dynamic balance. Two serpents, two directions, the tension between them producing not conflict but coherence. It is an image of liminality itself, the moment between states, the threshold where two things are simultaneously true. Hermes was born of a union between Zeus, the supreme god, and Maia, a Pleiad who dwelt in the caves of Mount Cyllene, herself a figure of concealment and mystery. He was born in a cave. He stole Apollo's cattle on the day of his birth. He invented the lyre before the sun had set on his first day of life. He was mischievous, brilliant, quick, and fundamentally untenable, a god who could not be contained by any single domain. He was the messenger between gods and humans. He was the patron of merchants and thieves, of travelers and tricksters, of language and of lies. He guided the souls of the dead. He was the only Olympian permitted to descend freely into the underworld and return. He escorted Persephone back to the upper world each spring. He guided the blind shade of Heracles down to Hades when the hero's mortal life was done. What made Hermes the Psychopomp, the conductor of souls, was not power in the conventional sense. He was not fierce, not judging, not terrible. What made him the guide was precisely his nature as a creature of thresholds. He belonged to no single domain and therefore could move between all of them. The dead needed someone who was neither fully alive nor fully dead, who could walk in the gray space between the two states without being claimed by either. Hermes was not the gatekeeper of the underworld. He was the escort to the gate. In the Homeric poems, he appears as a figure of extraordinary grace and swiftness, his golden sandals carrying him above the earth, above the sea, through levels of reality that no other deity could traverse with equal ease. In the Hermetic traditions that would develop from his mythology over subsequent centuries, he becomes something still more cosmic, the figure who mediates between all opposites, all polarities, all thresholds. Hermetic philosophy, the tradition that would deeply influence medieval alchemy, Renaissance magic, and certain strands of modern psychology, is built on the figure of the guide who holds two worlds simultaneously. There is something in this that is not merely mythological. The Greeks were not describing a supernatural postal worker when they imagined Hermes. They were describing a principle, the principle that every passage requires mediation, that the movement from one state to another is not a blank nothing but a charged, dangerous, sacred space that requires a particular kind of intelligence to navigate. And the Greeks, characteristically, gave that intelligence a name and a face and a pair of winged sandals. But Hermes, for all his complexity, was a figure of movement and light. He was swift, clever, gentle in his guidance. The underworld he escorted souls toward had a different character entirely, and at its border there waited a figure who embodied that difference completely. Charon was the ferryman of the dead. He stood at the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, at the bank of the river Styx, or sometimes the Charon, depending on which ancient source you consult, and he did not escort souls out of gentleness or divine commission. He conveyed them across for a fee, the coin. This is perhaps one of the most haunting details in all of ancient Greek practice, the custom of placing a coin in the mouth of the dead or over their eyes, so that when they arrived at Charon's shore, they would have something to offer him. The arbal, a small bronze coin, the currency of ordinary transactions in a living market economy, repurposed into the currency of the afterlife. Payment for passage, the toll of death. What is remarkable about this practice is not merely that it occurred, but that it was taken seriously enough to be practiced consistently across centuries of Greek and later Roman burial custom. Archaeologists have found the evidence in tombs and burial sites across the ancient Mediterranean. Coins in the precise position of the mouth, coins placed over closed eyes, coins tucked into the hands of the dead, as if for a journey that everyone, on some level, believed was real. Charon himself is a figure of darkness. Ancient sources describe him as ancient beyond reckoning, not merely old, but primordially aged, the kind of figure who preceded the Olympians themselves. He is often depicted as unkempt, his pheromones pole worn smooth by eons of use, his gaze indifferent to the grief of those he transports. He is not cruel exactly. He is simply what the threshold requires, absolute neutrality. He does not judge the dead. He does not comfort them. He does not explain where they are going. He takes the coin and he rows. What Charon represents, the psychopomp, as transaction, as the exchange required for passage, tells us something important about how the Greeks understood death. The river Styx was not simply a geographical feature of the underworld. It was a boundary with a specific character. It could be crossed, but not for free. The message encoded in this mythology is subtle and worth dwelling on. To cross from life to death required something from you. Not virtue necessarily. That judgment came later, in Elysium and Tartarus and the meadows of Asphodel. No, Charon simply required that you had prepared, that someone had loved you enough to give you the coin, that you had not been abandoned without ceremony, without memory, without the small economies of human care. The dead who arrived without coins, those who had died unburied, unmourned, without rites, were condemned to wander the near shore of the Styx for 100 years before Charon would take them, even without payment. The ritual of burial was not superstition. It was, in the Greek imagination, the final act of relationship between the living and the dead. The coin in the mouth was the last gift the living could give, and without it, the dead were not so much punished as they were abandoned, left in the grey space between worlds, neither here nor there, belonging fully to neither. There is something in this that the modern world has perhaps too quickly dismissed. Move south and east from the Greek world, cross the Mediterranean, follow the Nile to where it ceases to be a river and becomes a corridor, a dark, deliberate passage cut through stone, descending into the earth below a structure so vast that for 4,000 years it was the tallest thing human beings had ever built. Inside those corridors, on the walls of tombs rich and modest alike, there is a figure that appears with remarkable consistency. A human body, standing upright in the posture of authority, and where a human head should be, the long, elegant, black-furred face of a jackal. His name was Anubis. In the Egyptian cosmological tradition, Anubis was among the oldest of the gods, the god of embalming, of the necropolis, of the rituals that prepared the dead for the journey through the duat. He was said to have invented mummification itself, preserving the body so that the soul, the ka and the ba, those twin aspects of the Egyptian self, would have a physical anchor as it navigated the afterlife's complex geography. But Anubis was also, and perhaps most profoundly, the conductor of souls to the Hall of Two Truths, the chamber at the heart of the Egyptian afterlife, where the ultimate accounting of a human life would take place. This ceremony, depicted in extraordinary detail in the Book of the Dead and across the walls of countless tombs, is one of the most psychologically sophisticated inventions in the history of religion. In the Hall of Two Truths, the dead stood before 42 divine judges. They recited, one by one, the 42 confessions of innocence, a litany that covered every form of harm a person could inflict on another, from murder to gossip to cruelty to the land itself. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not spoken lies. I have not caused suffering without cause. The list is both legal and deeply human, an inventory of what it means to have lived in relationship with other beings and to have honored that relationship. And then came the scales. Anubis himself oversaw the weighing. The heart of the deceased, the seat of the soul, the repository of every choice and memory and desire the person had accumulated across a lifetime, was placed on one side of a great balance. On the other side was placed a single white feather, the feather of Maat, the principle of cosmic truth and order that the Egyptians considered the foundation of all existence. The heart was weighed against the truth. If the heart was light, if the life had been lived with integrity, with care, with justice, the scales balanced. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, recorded the result. The dead was welcomed into the paradise of the field of reeds, where the Nile flowed eternally and the harvest never failed. If the heart was heavy, burdened with harm, with unresolved wrongs, with the accumulated weight of a life lived in resistance to truth, the scales tipped. And waiting below the scales was Amit, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, the devourer, the great swallower. She consumed the heavy heart, and the soul was annihilated, not sent to some eternal punishment, but simply undone, ceased, as though it had never been. The precision of this mythology is almost unbearable to sit with. The Egyptians did not imagine death as a simple door into another room. They imagined it as the final and total account of a self, the moment when everything you had ever done, or avoided, or chosen, or sacrificed came to rest on a scale, to be weighed against the simplest and most absolute standard imaginable, truth itself. And Anubis presided over this, not as executioner, not as judge. The judges were the 42 who heard the confessions. Anubis was the guardian of the process, the tender of the scales, the figure who ensured that the weighing was conducted with the same care and ceremony he had brought to the preparation of the body in the embalming tent. He was both the beginning and the middle of the journey, the guide who prepared the dead for the road, and the guardian who ensured they faced the road's ultimate test with dignity. That the Egyptians imagined this figure as a jackal is not incidental. The jackal was a creature of edges, an animal seen most often at the boundaries of the inhabited world, at the margins of the desert, near the cemeteries that lay at the edge of every Egyptian settlement. Jackals were seen near graves. They were associated with the desert, which was the domain of the dead. They occupied the threshold between the world of the human and the world of the wild, the known and the unknown. In the Egyptian imagination, who better to guard the passage between life and death than the creature that already lived there? Now step entirely away from the ancient world as it is typically understood. Step across 10,000 miles of ocean and 2,000 years of calendar. Step into a civilization that had no contact with Egypt, no knowledge of Greece, no thread of communication with any old world tradition. Step into the Valley of Mexico, where a city called Teotihuacan was once the largest urban center in the Western Hemisphere, where pyramids rose toward a sky that had never heard the name of Zeus or Ra. In this world, among the Aztec and their predecessors, there was a figure who sat at the entrance to the underworld, a dog god, a creature of the threshold, a being whose function was to guide the newly dead through the 9 levels of Mictlan, the Aztec realm of the dead, to their ultimate destination. His name was Xolotl. Xolotl was depicted with the head of the Xolotl, the hairless dog, a breed indigenous to Mesoamerica, whose lack of fur was understood as a kind of nakedness, a vulnerability, a belonging to no comfortable category between animal and human. He was associated with lightning and with deformity, himself sometimes depicted as deformed, as monstrous in a way that was sacred rather than shameful, because the sacred was not always beautiful. He was the twin of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, and where Quetzalcoatl was associated with the morning star and the emergence of creation, Xolotl was associated with the evening star and the descent into darkness. His function was precise. When a person died, they began the 4-year journey through Mictlan's 9 levels. Each level presented a different obstacle, a vast plain swept by winds of obsidian shards, a field of blood, a darkness so complete that no human sense could navigate it. And through this darkness, specifically through this darkness, the dead needed Xolotl to lead them. He could see what they could not. He knew the way. The hairless dog had another role in Aztec ritual that deepens this symbolism considerably. Xolotl dogs were often buried with the dead, sacrificed as guides, as companions for the journey, as literal psychopomps placed in the tomb to do in death what Xolotl did in mythology. Archaeologists have found these burials across Mesoamerican sites. The dog in the tomb, curled beside its human, the final companion for the final journey. If you are paying attention, something should be troubling you by now. A dog god, guiding the dead through the underworld, associated with the margins between life and death, with the darkness the living cannot penetrate, with the threshold between the human world and whatever lies beyond it. Egypt had a jackal god, a canine deity who presided over the preparation of the dead, who guided souls to judgment, who occupied the liminal space between the embalming tent and the hall of truth. These two civilizations never met. The Aztec world and the Egyptian world were separated not only by the Atlantic Ocean, but by roughly 2,000 years of history. There is no credible evidence of contact, no shared language, no common ancestor religion that might explain the transmission of ideas. The cultures were, by every measure we have, entirely independent, and yet, the dog, the darkness, the guide, the threshold, the underworld with its levels and its challenges and its final destination that the dead cannot reach alone. This is not the only parallel. It is not even the most precise parallel. It is simply the most dramatic, the most geographically impossible, the most resistant to explanation by cultural diffusion or borrowed mythology. When you begin looking for the guide figure across the full range of human civilization, the pattern does not merely repeat, it proliferates. In Hindu cosmology, Yama, the god of death and Dharma, is accompanied by 2 dogs, Sharvara and Shyama, who guard the road to his realm and guide the dead on their approach. Dogs again. In Norse mythology, the great hound Garm guards the entrance to hell, the Norse underworld. In Mesopotamian mythology, among the oldest civilizations of which we have written record, Nergal rules the underworld with a court of figures who escort the dead through its 7 gates. In the Christian tradition, the figure of the angel of death, Azrael in the Islamic tradition, carries the soul from the body at the moment of death and conducts it toward its divine reckoning. In Shinto, the Japanese tradition, Izanami no Mikoto ruled the underworld following her death in childbirth, and the souls of the dead descended to her realm in Yomi. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition produced the Bardo Thardal, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, an entire manual for navigating the intermediate state between death and rebirth, a guide for the guideless, a text designed to do in literature what the Psychopomp did in mythology. The specific figures differ, the landscapes they inhabit differ, the cultural vocabularies are entirely distinct, but the structural elements are identical with a consistency that begins to feel less like coincidence and more like testimony. Always a threshold, always a figure who knows both sides of it, always a passage that the dead cannot make alone, always some form of preparation that the living must provide, and some form of knowledge that the guide must possess. If you lay these traditions side by side and strip away the cultural specifics, the jackal head, the winged sandals, the hairless dog, the ferryman's pole, the angel's wings, what remains is a single, coherent idea. The idea that the movement from life to death is not a simple cessation, but a structured experience, that it has stages, that it requires a guide, and that the guide is a particular kind of being, one who stands between worlds, who belongs to neither, who can navigate the darkness that the newly dead cannot navigate alone. Why? Why this specifically? Why not a god of death who simply receives the dead and assigns them a destination? Why not a mechanical system of cosmic judgment without a personal escort? Why does every tradition produce a figure whose primary characteristic is not power or judgment, but guidance? The question is not merely historical, it is pointing at something. In 1949, a scholar named Joseph Campbell published a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. His central argument was that the myths of vastly different cultures, separated by time and geography, repeatedly tell the same story, a structural pattern he called the monomyth. A hero departs from the ordinary world, crosses a threshold into a realm of challenge and transformation, and returns changed. The specific heroes differ. The specific challenges differ, but the pattern is remarkably consistent across traditions that could not have influenced each other. Campbell was building on the work of the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, who had spent decades arguing that the recurring figures of myth, the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, the great mother, the shadow, were not cultural inventions, but expressions of what he called archetypes, primordial patterns in what he termed the collective unconscious. For Jung, the psyche of every human being contained a common substrate, a shared architecture of psychological experience, and the figures of mythology were that architecture's dreams, the forms the unconscious took when it gave itself a face. The Psychopomp was, for Jung, one of the most significant of these archetypes. He wrote about it in the context of his own experience, the sense, in dreams, and in the practice of depth psychology, of a figure who leads the conscious mind into the deeper territories of the unconscious. The guide who takes you into the dark interior, and who, if you trust it, leads you not to destruction, but to a deeper understanding of who you are. This reframing, from external mythology to internal psychology, does not diminish the mythological traditions. It deepens them. It suggests that when the ancient Egyptians imagined Anubis guiding the dead through the duat, they were not simply inventing a cosmological bureaucracy to comfort the bereaved. They were encoding, in the language of image and symbol available to them, something that their culture had discovered about the structure of human experience in the face of the ultimate unknown. The guide is necessary because the unknown is not navigable by the ordinary self. The ordinary self, the self that knows how to buy bread and negotiate disputes and plan for the harvest, is not equipped for the dissolution that death represents. Something else is needed, a different kind of intelligence, one that is not afraid of the dark because the dark is its native territory, one that can hold the hand of whatever is terrified and say, without certainty and without deception, I know the way. Follow me. There is a modern scientific framework for what the ancient traditions were responding to, though it speaks a different language. It is called terror management theory, developed in the 1980s by social psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Piszczynski, drawing on the work of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, whose 1973 book, The Denial of Death, argued that the awareness of mortality is the central organizing fact of human civilization. Becker's thesis was radical and uncomfortable, that virtually everything human beings have ever built, believed, or created, from art to religion to political ideology to the drive for self-esteem, is, at its deepest level, a strategy for managing the terror of knowing that we will die. The guide for the dead, in this framework, is not a superstition or a consolation. It is a solution, a very specific, very psychologically sophisticated solution to a very specific problem. How do you convince the living that the dying are not simply lost? How do you make the ending of a person into something with a shape, a direction, a destination that can be mourned but not feared as absolute annihilation? You give the journey a guide. And here is the most interesting part. The guide does not simply comfort the dying. It comforts the living. It is the living who need Charon and Anubis and Hermes and Xolotl, not because they are the ones making the journey, but because they are the ones watching someone else take it, and finding in that watching the knowledge that one day they will make it themselves. The Psychopomp is a figure that the living create so that they can face what is coming. The mythology of death guidance is, in this sense, the most intimate self-portrait that human consciousness has ever produced. It is the mind drawing a map of what it most fears, and then placing in that map a figure who knows the territory, not to lie to itself, but to make the unknown survivable. And yet there is still something that this psychological interpretation, for all its elegance, does not quite account for. The interpretation explains why human beings would want a guide figure. It does not explain why the figure they independently imagined across every separated civilization has the same essential features. The liminal nature belonging to neither world, the animal association, the dog, the jackal, the creature of thresholds, the specific quality of the guidance, not commanding, not judging, but accompanying, the requirement of preparation, the coin, the embalming, the ritual, the correct words, the darkness through which the guide alone can see. If these features were simply projections of psychological need, we would expect more variation. We would expect some cultures to imagine a powerful warrior god who defeats the forces of death. We would expect some cultures to imagine a divine bureaucrat who processes the dead with administrative efficiency. We would expect the full range of what human imagination can produce when it turns to a problem. Instead, we get the guide, always the guide, always at the threshold, always in the middle space between two worlds, always capable of what the living and the dead separately cannot do, holding both realities at once. There is a word for a figure that appears spontaneously in different cultures as the same essential form. Jung's word, archetype, a template prior to its cultural expression, a pattern that the human mind generates because it is built into the structure of the mind itself, not learned, not transmitted, not borrowed from a common ancestor, but arising independently wherever human consciousness encounters the same fundamental challenge. The challenge is this: the self that you inhabit knows only one mode of existence. It knows the world of objects and relationships and time and memory. When it confronts the absolute boundary of that world, when it looks into the space beyond its own ending, it does not have and cannot have any direct experience to draw from. It faces a genuine void in its knowledge, and the mind, confronted with a void in its knowledge, does not simply accept the void. It generates a figure. It creates the one who knows what I do not know. It produces the Psychopomp. This is why every civilization needed a guide for the dead. Not because death was unknown. Every person who has ever lived has known, in the most visceral possible sense, that death exists. But because the territory beyond death was unknown, and the human mind, faced with unmapped territory, does not despair. It draws a map. And on the edge of the map, where the known world ends and the blank space begins, it places a figure facing outward, 1 foot in the familiar, 1 foot in the void, and gives that figure a name, a face, a pair of winged sandals, or a black furred head, or the body of a hairless dog standing in the darkness that it alone can navigate. What does it mean, then, to live with this knowledge? Not the mythological knowledge, not the knowledge of which God guides, which cultures dead through which cosmological landscape, but the deeper knowledge, the one that the myths were always pointing toward, that the human mind is constitutionally incapable of facing death as a blank nothing, that it will always and inevitably produce a guide, that the guide is not a lie told to the frightened. It is the shape that consciousness takes when it encounters its own limit and refuses to look away. The ancient Egyptians did not simply believe in Anubis. They practiced a relationship with the idea that life was a preparation for judgment, that every action accumulated a weight that would one day be measured, that the scales of mad were always, invisibly, already in motion. The feather was always already there, waiting, and the question that the 42 confessions were designed to answer was not simply did you obey the law, but something far more searching. Did you live in alignment with truth? The ancient Greeks who placed a coin on the tongue of their dead were not performing a superstitious ritual for the benefit of an imaginary ferryman. They were performing an act of relationship, a final acknowledgement that the dead had been real, had been loved, had been prepared. The coin was not for Charon. The coin was for themselves. The Aztec who buried a Xolotl dog beside a loved one was not simply following a religious custom. They were saying something that every civilization, in every language, has always been trying to say. You will not be alone in the dark. Something that loves you will lead you through. We have largely lost the ritual vocabulary that made these acts legible. We live in a world that has, with remarkable efficiency, sequestered the dying into institutions, the dead into the hands of professionals, the grieving into a social context that increasingly lacks the symbolic architecture to give their loss a shape. Death, for most people in the modern world, happens somewhere else. And the result, some argue, is not a culture that fears death less. It is a culture that fears it more, because it no longer has the figures, the myths, the guides, and the rituals to make the passage visible. The Psychopomp was never simply a religious figure. It was a technology of consciousness, a way of encoding in image and story and ceremony the knowledge that the passage from life to death is a structured experience, one that can be prepared for, one that can be witnessed, one that does not have to happen in isolation and terror. And here is the question that this ancient pattern seems finally to be asking, not of the dead, of the living. If every civilization in human history, separated by ocean and language and millennium and imagination, independently arrived at the same essential answer to the same essential question, if the human mind, left to its own deepest resources, reliably generates the figure of the guide, the companion at the threshold, the one who can see in the darkness. What is it, exactly, that the mind is trying to tell itself? The guides are waiting at the edge of every tradition we have inherited. Hermes stands at the crossroads, his staff balanced between two serpents. Charon waits by the black water, indifferent and absolute. Anubis lifts the scales in the hall of two truths, his jackal eyes calm and without judgment. Xolotl stands at the entrance to the 9 levels of darkness, patient as the hairless dog that has always lived at the edge of the human world. They are all the same figure. They have always been the same figure, and the figure is not outside you. It never was. This is Temple of Mysteries. The question has never been where we go when we die. It has been what we are, that we have always known we needed a guide. The oldest structures in the world were not tombs, they were puzzles. And what was hidden at the center was never what anyone expected. Next time, we follow the thread into the labyrinth.